My name is Daniel Dresner. I want to thank you all very much for coming to the conference on Weaponized Interdependence in World Politics. Before I start, I want to thank most profusely the Russian Eurasia program here at the Fletcher School, particularly managed by Arthur Rakovsky, as well as the Carnegie Corporation, which is a generous funder of that program. And I also want to thank the people who are about to present, Henry Farrell and Abe Newman. In some ways, Marty Finnemore said to me right before I spoke that in some ways here, I'm the Tupperware lady, which is to say that what I'm doing is sort of presenting the wares, not that I have created, but that others have created, but that I think are terrifically useful. Say that, you can argue in terms of studying the global political economy, there had been a lot of sort of, debates that many of us, were old enough been in grad school for a long time ago, remember between sort of realist perspectives on interdependence, liberal perspectives on interdependence, and indeed the interdependence argument has been around since the days of Immanuel Kant and Norman Angell, with the idea that by and large the perspective has been that this is only to the positive. That is, interdependence creates mutual dependency, which means that actors will not engage in behavior that would stabilize or lead to violence. You can argue that Henry and Abe's work, which they are going to present, and I don't want to preview too much, represents a direct challenge to that. Not in the same way I think that very often realists phrase this, to point out that interdependence can breed insecurity, but rather the ways in which interdependence can actually unintentionally to dramatically asymmetric forms of it, and in some ways empowers some actors at the expense of others. And that furthermore, these forms of interdependence are often so great that escaping them or decoupling yourself from these systems is in fact far more complicated and far more costly than previously understood. And so with that, the way we're going to approach the conference is first Henry and Abe are going to present four crux of their argument, which appeared in International Security over the summer. Then we will have another panel later on the sort of implications of this for international relations theory. And then tomorrow, we will have a series of panels highlighting the ways in which weaponized interdependence as a concept plays out in global finance, in terms of online activity, in terms of energy and transit and pipelines and infrastructure, and then another panel essentially on the forms of sort of resistance and reaction to this, which is in some ways, weaponized interdependence has caught a lot of us by surprise. Even people that are supposed to pay attention to this stuff for a living. And so the question is, how can actors, not just powerful ones, but also potentially less powerful ones, respond to that? But first, we need to understand the crux of the argument, and rather than me doing it as the Tupperware lady, let me introduce the Tupperware. So please extend a round of applause for Henry Farrell and Abe Newman.
So, thank you so much, Dan, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you to the Fletcher School for hosting us. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation for funding. And thank you to all of you for having come, in many cases for considerable distances here to participate in this conference. And I should say, that Dan said some very, very kind words about us. We also, so we have been drawing from conversation in these ideas. These ideas draw upon conversations that we have had over years, over decades, with many people in this room, Dan included. And it's really, really exciting for both of us to be at this moment where the paper is out, and we're now able to feed back into the conversation, to feed back into conversations, arguments. Other people can take these ideas, can agree with them, can disagree with them, can bring them in directions that we didn't ever anticipate. So this is a very, very exciting moment for, I think, both Abe and I. So what we want to talk about, we want to talk through briefly what the weaponized interdependence idea is, which is what I'm going to talk about, and then Abe's going to talk about where we want to go next. What are the important issues out in the world? What is the agenda that this lays out as we see it? And then hopefully we hope to hear what other people have to say in response to that over the course of the next 24, 36 minutes. So we have a very straightforward argument. The argument is that we have not paid enough attention in international political economy, in international security, to the role of economic networks. If we think about globalization, globalization is made out of networks, made out of financial networks, like the SWIFT messaging system, which we talk about in the paper, like the dollar clearing system, made out of informational networks. It's also made out of production networks that have led to these vast disaggregated supply chains, which have made manufacturing into a fundamentally decentralized phenomenon, which can happen across tens or dozens, or even in some cases of 50 or 100 nations. So that has been the big story of the last 20 years, has been the creation of these networks. And these networks, in a certain sense, they provide a kind of a structure to the international economy. This structure has consequences. In particular, it has consequences for power, and it has consequences for the ways in which states interact with each other. It allows states to exercise coercive capacities, which are quite different in some significant ways from the kinds of interdependence that people like Bob Cohen and Joe Nye talked about in the 1970s, 1980s. They were interested in the ways in which asymmetric interdependence between two countries could serve as a form of leverage. And what we see here now is that when these networks get created, they become essential to the functioning of the global economy. And by cutting people out, by cutting states out of these networks, you can exercise some pretty extraordinary coercive force. And so this is having all sorts of consequences, which we are beginning to realize. And we have been, frankly, lucky for certain very, very dubious values of luck and when the piece came out. Because, of course, when we look at the various things that are happening in the world, many of the forms of economic disruption that we are seeing can be characterized, can be understood in terms of the broad phenomena that we are talking about, and in terms of related phenomena too, which we are only beginning to think about how to map out properly. So, first of all, as I say, globalization is about the creation of world-spanning networks. These networks that effectively tie together, unite all of these different economies. So we used to have national economies coming together, or national economies which looked to be relatively discrete, with obviously connections of trade and of finance between them back in the 1970s, 1980s. But these economies were relatively independent from each other. And as globalization proceeds, these markets and these economies become more and more interpenetrated with each other. And the way in which they become interpenetrated is through the building of all of these networks that we have. Networks bind the world together, create a very, very different kind of economy than we had before. There are historical precedents for this, albeit I don't think anything that is quite as intimately interconnected as what we see today. But nonetheless, there's a fundamental transformation that happens over the last 20 to 30 years in how the world economy works. And this has led, obviously, to a lot of commentary and to a lot of very, very enthusiastic prognostication. So there was a standard view on networks until about, let's say, 2 years ago, which is networks are awesome. Networks are all about creating these circumstances for economic efficiency. They're all about creating these wonderful new ways in which people can cooperate with each other. And most importantly, networks are flat. They are seen as being a kind of an alternative to traditional forms of power, because networks, they look to be these really decentralized things in which, here, if you look in the middle, you see a city, the grid of a city streets. And here, if you're trying to get from point A to point B, and there is a traffic intersection which is blocked, you can easily route around it. So people think about networks in these kinds of ways. They think about networks as effectively being like these flat, homogeneous grids where it is possible to get from point A to point B, and which allow for clever, agile actors effectively to route their way around power asymmetries. So this is a kind of argument that you see in a popularized version in people like Friedman, The World is Flat. You see it in a more sophisticated version in the arguments of people like Anne Marie Slaughter, that networks effectively, that they serve in a certain sense as a kind of an antidote to power relations. This is not true. And we know this if we look at how these networks actually work. If we look at the form that these networks take, we see that by and large, these networks tend to be pretty fundamentally asymmetric. That is to say that some nodes in the network are much, much, much more important than others. Here we have a cute little picture, which some of you will be familiar with. I flew Delta this morning from DC to Boston, and this is basically it's a map of one particular kind of network, which is the hub and spoke network that Delta Airlines uses in order to organize its flights. And you will see that some points in this network are far, far more important than others. Basically, if you want to get nearly anywhere in the world, you've got to fly through Atlanta first. And this is a pain for those of us who don't particularly like Atlanta's airport. Now, this actually has a cutesy example because it's an example that everybody is familiar with. But if you look at many of the networks that shape the world, you will actually see a pretty similar topography. You will see that there are some nodes in these networks that are vastly more important than others, some nodes through which are far more densely interconnected with the rest of the network, some nodes that effectively serve as being these junctions, which then sort of have great consequences for how the rest of the network operates. These nodes, these patterns emerge in a variety of ways. Sometimes, as with Delta, it's because it's a simple and economic way of trying to minimize costs. Sometimes it emerges because some actors want to exercise the network. They have an interest in making sure that they have control. And sometimes it emerges in a very, very decentralized way through rich get richer phenomena. So that, for example, the internet looks pretty similar to this, not because there's somebody who's essentially designing it, but just because if you are slightly more likely to connect to one node than another, these natural advantages build up in a standard process which can be modeled mathematically so that you end up with a grossly disparate number of number of connections going to a very, very small number of nodes. The simple and straightforward argument that we make, and so this describes some of the ways in which this can happen, the simple and straightforward argument that we make is that this has consequences for power. If you have networks not being these symmetric flat things which allow actors to route around power relations, but instead they turn out to be asymmetric, sooner or later this is going to become a way in which actors can exercise power, including non-economic actors such as states. So our basic argument, and we lay it out in great depth in the paper, which some of you presumably have read, is so that this effectively allows some privileged states to use these hubs in order to coerce other states to get things done that they want to get done. So these hubs, if you are a state which has some form of control over a hub, perhaps it's located within your geographic control, perhaps you have some other means of exercising control over it, you are then able to use this in order to coerce other states. And we describe how this works through what we describe two basic ways in which this has important strategic consequences. One of these is one which will be been following the news over the last several years, which is what we call the panopticon effect, after Jeremy Bentham's famous proposal for a prism, in which it will be possible to see every cell from a single central point. And if you have control of a central hub, a central node in the network, you can then use this in order to see what everybody is saying to everybody else. And this can provide some pretty profound strategic advantage. So you can think about this in terms of how the NSA was capable of using the asymmetric topology of the internet in order to listen in at key junction points and to grab up vast swathes of communication, which turned out to be extraordinarily strategically valuable. You can actually see similar phenomena having happened in the lead up to World War I. There is a fantastic book that describes how effectively the United Kingdom tried to exercise similar kinds of effects through its access to privileged information from insurance markets and from other markets in order to be able to get a step up on the Germans. And the other effect that we talk about is the choke point effect, which is if you are a state which is capable of controlling a node, if you're capable of controlling one of these key hubs, you can effectively deny other states access to the rest of the network, and this can have devastating consequences. An obvious example of this in the last number of years was Iran under the Obama administration, where you saw effectively the reason why Iran was willing to come to the table on the JCPOA was in large part because the United States had used, together with the European Union, had used its control of the global financial system in order to effectively cut Iran completely out. On the one hand, by using the SWIFT financial messaging system, which is essential to international transactions, by forbidding Iranian banks to have access to it. On the other hand, by using the dollar clearing system in order to scare the hell out of any banks that even might think about doing business with Iran. And between these two, this had massive and devastating consequences for the Iranian economy, so that if you are able to use your control of the hub to create a choke point, you can really exercise some very, very profound and important power, which we think is something that is worth studying. And Abe is going to take you through the rest.
Look at those lids, everybody. These Tupperware lids are amazing. You snap right on. So, thing that we just want to emphasize is that in the paper we talk about the internet and finance. And we're starting, actually, it's very focused on Europe, because that's where we began kind of investigating these things. But where you see this happening in the day-to-day papers is really a lot in the Asian sphere. So especially between the United States and China. You think about the Huawei interactions, but also it's not just US and China. There was recently an incident between Japan and South Korea over key chemicals that are important to the flat screen industry. These things, when you have the weaponized interdependence lens on, you start to see them everywhere. The Rusal sanctions against Russia. There's just basically, in our vision of the world, this is becoming a first tool that the administration, not just this administration, but the previous administration as well, turns to when they're trying to think about how do they deal or grapple with a key geostrategic problem. So even though it's happening more and more, there's also this question of like what happens when a major power like the United States uses this over and over. And this is a quote from Jack Lew, the former Treasury Secretary. He says, if we keep using these tools in this way, is there some risk that we start to undermine this power, this ability to use the infrastructure of these networks in order to achieve our geostrategic ends? And here, that's what I think we're hoping in the next kind of 36 hours, we can really get at these kinds of questions. So what we want to kind of talk about is stuff that we don't really know yet, where we're just starting to fumble through some of our ideas. And I'm going to lay out, what I think Henry and I would say are our first best guesses of what the next steps of this project are. But we really are hoping that, in the next 36 hours, we're going to hear more. What about this? You guys didn't think about that. And that's great, because we were hoping, over the next several years to really build this out, and hopefully you will as well. So the first question is this true, this hub characteristic? Is this always true in global economic networks? And here, as you move from your left to right, you see, at least in network theory, not all networks have this centralized characteristic. Some, the more random graph networks, they're much more decentralized. You have kind of what we were talking about, we're kind of in the middle or on your right side. But really part of the question is empirically, if you map the global economic networks, how do they pan out? And at least from kind of a very first look, you have things like spot markets for oil, where you think, okay, that's really much more of the decentralized network. That's not where states have the power in order to control these issues. But what they do have the place where they have the control is in the payment systems. And so there's another network that's layered over the other network, where one is decentralized, the other one isn't. And so when you think about what is the policymaker's question, it's to kind of identify where can they get leverage in the overlapping character of the different constructions of the global economic structure. So one of our kind of challenges is to really map out across a wide range of economic areas, what is just the terrain, the topography of these global economic networks. The second one is about activation. A lot of what the paper is about is the structural condition, is saying global economic networks look a certain way, they create a certain structure or topography, and the question is, when can states utilize that to their end? And in the paper, we start to play with these first two issues. The first is about just state capacity. Do you have the expertise to identify this as an issue, and can you force it on your adversaries? And a lot of this is both legal capacity. You have the laws that let you do that. So we walked through how 9/11 created a whole bunch of new legislative powers for the executive to use these kinds of tools. But it's also about, do you have the knowledge to do this? And one case that we've been looking at that's not in the paper, but we think is very important, is the Rusal sanctions, where there's a part of the aluminum market that is very specific. It's about how this high-end aluminum that's used in the European production cycle for their cars, that the policymakers in Treasury, they were not anticipating that that sanction would have such a consequence on this very specific part of the supply chain, and that led to kind of a lot of frustration on both sides in Europe and in the United States about what were this sanctions policy doing. And so one of our takeaways is that if we're going to employ these types of tools, we really have to have tremendous expertise in how economic markets function. The point is just about what are the norms that allow you to use these tools. And in some cases, these are the norms about the target. So is it legitimate to use this tool to go after terrorists? Okay? I think after 9/11, there was very little pushback about that. But if you think about Apple's decision after the San Bernardino attack to encrypt its technology and not give that over to the state, the norms about that target, about using these kinds of tools for different types of targets, have eroded. And we would argue that that is going to happen in other areas as well. Like with China, you see right now the administration is ramping up what I would call an ideological position, saying that Chinese human rights, their treatment of Uyghurs, that is something that we have to push back against and use these tools to do it. Well, the legitimacy of that globally is that a legitimate target for these weapons to enforce human rights sanctions? You could imagine a future administration using these tools for more environmental goals, to say, we have to confront global warming and we're going to go after you with these tools if you don't deal with that. And so the legitimacy of that target we think is really important for it. But the other is the legitimacy not just of the target, but also of the actors involved. So a lot of times the targets are the firms. They're the private sector actors. They're the people that are being forced to comply with these rules. And in our paper, we look at in the internet space, the United States did not use choke point tools. They used much more the panopticon tools, and we argue that that is really about these legitimacy questions, that it was not legitimate because of our kind of general conception of how the internet works, to cut people off from it. And then there's a question of, in the future, could that change? Could we develop different norms, a kind of a more splintering of the internet where people say, that actually is quite legitimate? Final points are just how, which we just barely touch on in the paper, is that this type of power relies on the network complying with these demands. That a state like the United States says, you know what, Google, you're not allowed to sell your operating system to Huawei anymore. You're not allowed to provide updates to them anymore. And then the question is, what does Google do? They sit in this decision of, do they comply with that or not? And one of the things that I think we'd like to explore going forward is, what space do firms have either to activate these tools? Like, we have a very interesting example after 9/11. FedEx basically said, we're going to step up. We're going to help fight terrorism. We're going to give information to the US government. And for them, it was a strategy that they, the CEO said he believed in it, but you can also imagine it was a brand strategy to say that they're part of the American fight on terrorism. But you can also see what Microsoft is doing today, where they're saying, we are not part of that coalition. They're creating a set of norms called the Digital Geneva Convention, where they're trying to argue that firms should not be placed in this position. And we're going to see, I think, more and more global companies having to decide where do they fall and what's their exposure. In a lot of cases, their exposure is their compliance department. That's who's enforcing them and making sure that they comply with these rules. So do these compliance departments, do they continue to hold sway, the threat of some kind of, that they'll get sanctioned? Or do the leadership of a company say, our brand image is more important than the risk of some kind of enforcement action? So this section, you might think of as like our scope conditions page, like when can this weaponized interdependence happen? And these are some of the ways that we're thinking through when it may or may not be able to be leveraged, but we'd like to add to this kind of discussion. The second thing that we really want to do pushing forward is what we do in the conclusion of the paper, is to think about, is this a dynamic model? How does it change over time? So what Henry presented was really the static view. It was like, if you have this structure, what can you do? Tupperware. Here, this is, if you're in this position, what are other people likely going to do over time in response to that? And here, we're thinking about a range of strategies that could, that could happen. I'd like to start at the top, which is, when do hubs disappear? And this is really, I think, it's a huge question for network theorists. They don't have, there's this idea that there's a path dependency. Then there's another kind of set of ideas that, well, hubs are really, they're historically contingent and they can just go away. They can kind of vanish overnight. There's some kind of tipping point. Green has a very troubling article that he wrote about a year ago where he makes the argument that, actually the pound, it lost to the dollar in a very sudden set of moments. It wasn't this path dependent that kept going on for over time. There was a bunch of contingent events and poof, it's gone. And so we don't have an answer to that, but I think we need to study more, when can hubs disappear and when do they persist? The second set of questions is, what do target states do in response to this? And some of the things are very standard in a kind of IR framework. They bandwagon. That's what Europe did in after 9/11. They said, if the United States has the NSA, let's use the NSA. That will be helpful to us too. And they did. They took a huge advantage of that. But what we're starting to see is other states are doing other things. Like one set of states that we would argue are insulating themselves from these hubs. They're creating their alternative set of these networks. So if you think about China, right after the September 11th attacks, after we started using these choke point attacks, they created an alternative to SWIFT, to that financial messaging system. They created their own financial messaging system. And of course, it was just supposed to be cooperative and it's not anything, it's like, so these kinds of actions are just the first moving actions of potential targets to distance themselves from these networks. Russia, for example, has been exploring using blockchain technology, which is another way to get around these kinds of choke points in the financial messaging system. But another thing that we think is even more troubling is when actors decide that their best strategy is to infect the hubs of the primary state. And so this is, we would argue, is what doing in the internet space, is don't just try to insulate yourself, don't just bandwagon, but destroy the privileged state's ability to use those hubs as a coercive tool. And if you just overpower the hubs with garbage and nonsense, they will no longer be effective in that kind of panopticon space. So we're just starting to work those out, but we would love to hear more, there's got to be other ways that states are thinking about responding to them. The next kind of set of conversations is, what are the alternatives for firms? And I kind of already previewed this a little bit with Microsoft and their strategy of kind of setting up a set of competing norms about what is and is not acceptable use of these networks. The point that we want to explore more is how networks are interacting with each other over time. Because you get this word network, it makes you a little bit numb. You just think there's like a network. But really there's a multiplicity of networks involved. Often they're interacting in very peculiar ways. So we'll just take the case of Huawei for a second. Huawei started to build this new internet infrastructure globally called 5G. And why is there such a crisis about 5G? It's because the United States is worried that they will Snowden us, right? That we Snowden them, we were listening in to everything they did. But if they build the next generation network, then they will be able to do that to us. So if you're trying to explain why is the United States freaking out about China and Huawei, it's not because of trade tariffs, or it's not about, because Huawei is such a big company. It's because this strategic asset could be taken over, this hub, by China, who is a pure competitor. Then if you look at how did the United States respond to this issue, they responded by using a different set of networks. They said, okay, to prevent you from building this dominance in the information network, we are going to use our supply chains to cripple that company. What they did is they put Huawei on this blacklist for component suppliers, and as a result of that, Huawei can't build its technology. So if it can't get access to Qualcomm chips, US semiconductors, then it can't provide this infrastructure that it's proposing. And so what we're seeing is this interaction of different networks where maybe you don't have a hub in some space. The United States doesn't have a 5G equipment maker to compete in that sector, but they can use this other area, the supply chains network, in order to battle that war. The last kind of area that we think for research is a much more immediate set of questions. So if you think about the first was the conditions, then we were thinking about more dynamics, how do networks evolve over time. But this is more like the battlefield. What happens in kind of a very kind of short time span when you start to use these tools? And Henry and I, the way we think about this is that right now we're in like a 1945 moment where the players on the battlefield don't really understand the tools they're using. They're stumbling through these things they've discovered, and they're like new toys. And aren't these toys fun? And they do things that maybe it looks like they're really powerful, but there's also this chance that these things could spiral out of control. And it's very unclear, at least in the great power context, of what are the rules of the road for using these types of tools. And so here we're just thinking about, okay, who has the capacity to escalate the conflict? Do you have the institutions on your side that could match the privileged states' institutions? So for example, right now what you see is the United States is using a lot of these tools in the network space, and China's responding with what we would call market power. It's not actually using the network. It doesn't have privileged hubs in many network spaces. What it has is it has a very large market. And so it's using very traditional geoeconomic tools to respond because it has the capacity over those things. The second set of issues that we think are important are the issues of credibility. When are these things likely to escalate into misunderstanding or miscalculation? And we think here it's really important to give clear signals of what are your intentions. How credible is your threat and how credible are you to stand by it? And here we would make the argument that you really should have a rules-based process to come to decide if you're going to use these tools. So we've been very, I think, worried when we see that the Trump administration has used these in a much more kind of exchange-based, relational, like, oh, you want something on trade, we'll then relax these sanctions on Huawei. And that kind of, once you put these tools into that vision, then it's very hard for your partner, the Chinese, to understand how credible of a threat is this? Are you really gonna kill this company, ZTE or Huawei or whatever it is? Or are you just using this as kind of a ploy? And when you do that, then the escalation dynamics could get worse. The final point is that we think that the battlefield in a lot of this setting is the network itself. It's not about proxy states, like Libya versus, the kind of the old world of the Cold War. It's really the front line is Apple and Microsoft, the companies themselves. And so it's very easy for a state to say, I'm getting what I want because this other person is backing down. But at what cost? If you're destroying your domestic semiconductor industry because they can't sell their stuff anymore, you might have won the battle, but did you really win the war? So let me just have a few conclusions. The first is kind of what Henry started the conversation at the beginning, which is that economic networks are not just about cooperation, efficiency, and win-win situations. These economic networks create vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities can be used by states as a site of control. We think that states are going to seek to protect themselves from these types of coercive tools, but we are not envisioning a kind of world of decoupling. We do not think that it's very possible for large actors like the United States and China to just dissolve all of their relationships with each other. Much more likely that we're going to see is kind of like a divorce where you still have children. Okay? You fight over those children, you fight over your relationship with each other, but you also have to continue this conversation. And the question is how you manage those conflicts and how do you minimize the threats that are involved rather than thinking about what really decoupling would be, which is Brexit. We're seeing it as slow motion train wreck, it's happening. The question is, can we really envision that for the global economy? The third point is just about that there's a rebalancing of security over efficiency. And I think a lot of people are very uncomfortable with this, that security concerns, it just goes back to the Alexander Hamilton. Do I have to say anything more? It's there are places where security does matter. And we were deluded, or we were sold a bill of goods that we didn't need to think about those issues anymore. And our argument is that, security is going to play a role in economic decision making. And that's okay. We don't need to freak out. We don't need to throw everything over the baby out with the bathwater. We just need to come up with a set of practices that will allow this world to persist. And that's kind of our final point, which is that, Henry and I have been thinking, in the paper at least, it's much more an academic argument, about like liberals say this and realists say that, and we want to have this other conversation. But we really think to make this all bite, you have to translate it and come up with a strategic toolbox for policymakers to say, what should you be concerned with? When can you use these tools? When are you likely to get leverage out of them? And we're hoping that in the next, year or so, that we can start putting a little work into that effort. Thanks, everybody.
We've got 20 minutes for questions before the next panel, so I'll let you guys,
I don't know if one thing I
Can
wonder.
you identify yourself? Sorry.
Timothy Smith, Accidental Americans Association of the European Union. One thing I've noticed, maybe in just my own experience, I do think you mentioned this kind of three responses to these actions, one of which is the bandwagoning effect. One consequence I wonder how much impact is going to be is I think the whole Brexit process. I mean, the UK I always saw as kind of the ultimate bandwagon state. If the US did something and around the EU table, the UK was always the country to say, well, let's join in, let's support the US, almost no matter what the US did. The fact that the UK is losing so much power and so much influence and it's just kind of circling the drain, is that making these conflicts much more, is it generating much more conflict in the economic sphere? Because I imagine like a September 11th type event where I'm almost certain that among the EU nations, the UK was saying, we should support the US. And, and now if you had that same type of event after Brexit, you wouldn't have the UK in the room saying that, and you could have a much different response, a much more defiant or let's refuse to cooperate type of response to the US. And I wonder how much, I know the UK is a relatively small country. I wonder how much just that one event, that the impact is having.
Yeah, I mean, in this argument, what we would focus on is when you have an economic hub, what's the nearest competitor to that economic hub? And for the United States, for its financial system, London is the near-term competitor. And so Brexit really strengthens the US position in kind of this global financial domain. And so, it's like a gift to the Trump administration if they want to use these tools, in our vision of the world. And on the flip side, what you see is there's been this recent effort by the Hong Kong Stock Exchange to purchase the London Stock Exchange. And in our vision of the world, that's a really bad thing for US power. So, that's just kind of how we would think about Brexit and how it's playing out within our lens of the world.
Hi, it's Bruce Jennison from Duke. Sorry for being late, but traffic. So I think the framework is really fascinating and valuable, and I think the fleshing out you guys are trying to do now is really important. Just two thoughts on that, it'll come up another time. So one is the slide you had, Abe, that had the looking at the counter strategies of target states, right? Which I think, as you said, doesn't really get developed as much in the initial paper, because that's really important to avoid having an overly static conception of power, right? Because the ability to impose costs, economic costs, doesn't necessarily bring the achievement of your strategic objective. I think the Iran case is really interesting. We can talk more about that. Because among the strategies you have there, the others are, not just counter networks, but moving it over to another level, another area of escalation, right? In which risks go up and all sorts of other things. So I think that's going to be really important to have a conception of power that gets at the capacity to use that to achieve your objectives, not just imposition of costs. And second thing is and you state this a lot in the paper, the importance of the right domestic institutions to do it here. And so it takes me back to the small state, weak state work of Katzenstein and Krasner and others, and Dan Yergin's book, and the role that national security has played in the strengthening of the American state. Right, you see it in World War I and World War II. You get these enormous powers, economic regulatory powers over how many colors on a typewriter ribbon or rationing of food, and then it ratchets down, and then the Cold War doesn't ratchet down because it's continuing. Your point about 9/11, and it's okay to have efficiency and security interrelated. But what's the downside of that as well, right? That can distort in some ways your ability to compete, right? If you allocate resources in certain areas that are heavily security and they're not really, you're competing with China or whomever, or you're developing certain technologies, ways it plays into other balance between national security and civil liberties and others. So I think that the point you're making about, sort of the unipolar moment in the 90s and then the message of 9/11, in some ways 9/11 is even more challenging to get this balance right, because it may well end up more open-ended than even the Cold War was. So the domestic institutions, it seems to be useful to go back to that, strong state, weak state, and see how valid some of those arguments are now and what kind of updating that they need, both theoretically and applied.
Those are fantastic and very helpful comments. I would say, with respect to the first, this is absolutely right. So there's one interesting way in which you can think about one part of this is looking, as you say, Iran is a very good case, looking at the JCPOA, what's happening at the moment, where effectively two things have changed between what led up to the JCPOA and what's happening right at the moment. The first is that the Europeans were on board JCPOA. They are not now. And so here I think is when, and Dan actually has a piece where he, I think said this years and years ago, that if you are going to see these things potentially getting challenged, challenge is not going to happen from the target states themselves very often. It's going to happen, as Abus was saying, from the states which are not peers with the United States, but still also have some power. So the key question here is, the Europeans are beginning to gear up. They're trying to think about how it is that they can insulate themselves against these kinds of attacks in the future. They don't particularly care about Iran, but they worry very much that what the United States has been doing unilaterally in order to try and push to isolate Iran could be used, even under a Warren administration, say 2020, to isolate Europe from Russia. That if you have extensive Russian sanctions, this is going to have big consequences for the European economy. And so you see a whole bunch of people talking about how Europe needs to build up capacities in order effectively to be able to, quote, deter, unquote, the United States by saying, if you do this to our businesses, we are going to do this right back to yours. The second thing, of course, that is different is that the clear end game, and this is much more standard sanctions 101, that you need to have a clear, okay, if you do this, the sanction is going to be taken away. And the Trump administration doesn't have that. The basic thing seems to be either it's going to be the nuclear program, or else it's terrorism, or else we just want to get, we want to destroy your state in general. Who the hell knows? And it changes from day to day. And so this is extremely problematic. Part of the question, I think, there clearly are going to be some inefficiencies and problems associated with this. There are also going to be various efforts by businesses to try and jump on the new bandwagon. So that if you see, for example, Facebook's new argument is more or less, well, you may not like us, but we're sure it's going to be a hell of a lot better than our Chinese equivalent. You shouldn't want to get rid of us because we are much better than the alternative. You can see as these new forms of geostrategic competition ramping up, many other companies are wanting to get their access to whatever hose of government money is going to be coming out of that. On the other hand, you also see that this is going to plausibly lead to a much more significant role for the United States in the economy. And that's, so that has positive consequences possibly, as well as negative consequences. You can see how this could go together with the kinds of, developmental state kind of argument, because this has been the United States has been most willing to get engaged in this for security rather than economic reasons. That could have benefits. And there is going to be a second image reversed effect here as well, where you're going to see bureaucracies using this as an excuse to get much more money, much more resources. And this is what is happening in the European Union at the moment. People in the United States are not paying attention to the debates of the last few weeks. It's very clear that the European Commission sees this as an opportunity to build up a very different model of legitimacy than it had in the past, when it was all about open markets and free competition. Now the European Commission wants to be all about national champions on the one side and building up European economic strategy on the other, and figuring out how the two intersect to create a happy family. And this is going to create a transformation of the European state, I think, which is very interesting.
I just wanted to also add about the objectives, that what the objective is also affects how states respond. You just see this in the China example right now. It started, it was very much a compliance objective. You know, they were breaching sanctions, the companies need to come in compliance with US law. Then it became a national security objective. Huawei can't be trusted to have this infrastructure because they'll listen in. Okay, so then you have to create transparency rules about their technology. Most recently, it's an ideological demand, which is, you know, the Chinese regime is bad and it's using this to promote authoritarianism. That's much, I think, you know, you can choose whatever objective you want, but the type of threat that it poses to your target changes, you know, how existential is that?
Thanks for this. I'm Marty Finnemore from George Washington University. Thanks for this. This is super exciting. I have just a clarification question that I'd like you to speak to briefly, which is how much of this argument is about interdependence and how much is about plain old dependence? Right? There is fuzziness and slippage in the examples, at least as I'm reading the examples. A number of these cases, so for example, with the Swift messaging system or with a lot of your choke point examples, I'm not seeing the inter. Right? It's just dependence. And so because B is dependent on A is going to put the squeeze on B. And okay, well, that's the way things roll. How much work is the mutual dependence doing in this to make this a new kind of power argument that isn't, you know, has the value added, the new kind of, why should I buy your new top?
Okay, well, this is a.
Now you've gotten to the core of it.
Isn't Tupperware just Tupperware? Don't they have a million of those lids floating around?
Well, am I being clear about the question though? Because it's not clear, for example, you know, Iran, there's not so much interdependence here. This looks to me like they're just vulnerable.
Okay, well, I think the answer to this is pretty straightforward. You know,
Good.
that's at least that's okay. I see Barry is also.
After you respond to her, I want to kind of follow up. With it.
You mean you and I are on the same page?
We're just querying.
Oh.
Just querying.
Okay. Okay, so it depends on what you mean by it. So if you go back to Cohen and Nye, there's a standard story there, which is a story about how the world is becoming more interdependent in a variety of ways, and they think that about this as being a state-to-state type thing. They've got a lot of great and interesting examples of how it is that states can be, you know, as states become dependent on product from state E, you know, state A is dependent on product from state B. State B is able to possibly use this in all sorts of unfortunate ways against state A, and so they've got a pretty standard story there. The story is that this is not in fact how interdependence develops. Interdependence doesn't develop as just being more and more diffuse interconnections between states. Instead, interdependence assumes a structure. The structure is the networks. You know, so if you want to think about how interdependence works these days, it works because you have these networks substrate, if you want to use that terminology, for interdependence. And so then, you know, once that substrate becomes a thing, sooner or later, states stumble into the fact that there are all of these juicy new sort of opportunities that they have as a result of this. So if you want to say, you know, this is dependence rather than interdependence, I think that's, you know, I think you can say that, but it is dependence upon a specific set of structures that have emerged in order to make interdependence work. And so that's where the interdependence comes in, is that, you know, effectively interdependence is, you know, it is not just a state-to-state thing in the standard way that we use to be. It is dependent upon these global networks. These global networks have a topography. That topography has consequences.
The consequence is dependence. Just being clear here.
Well, it's asymmetric
Right, so I guess, so maybe this is definition,
like,
like,
what we
asymmetric?
would argue is that like a lot of the literature focused on mutual interdependence, and we're bringing it back to asymmetric interdependence. And then what's the channel of that asymmetric interdependence?
So
It's that the private firm networks create these structures that then allow states to take advantage of it.
Put more simply, if you want to be super precise, you could say that what we're talking about is dependence upon the structures that make interdependent possible. But
That's
that would
too
be-
long a title.
Exactly, that would be a pretty horrible title.
Yeah, I agree.
The article.
Barry, did you have a two?
Yes, it's always dangerous in situations like this to talk about like the real thing, the real example. This is, you brought up the first
Bring it. We
the
like
first
realism.
JCPOA, coercive effort, effort. Look at the second one. Okay, so the United States is squeezing Iran and is trying to muscle other countries into allowing it to squeeze Iran. And the stylized description of where we are in that is the Iranians are really hurting. If the Iranians are really hurting because the Iranians are in fact, stylized argument, are in fact in an asymmetrical dependence relationship. They are victims of the phenomena that you describe, in which there are choke points. The Americans sit on the choke points. They have the leverage. The Iranians are basically just boxed. Okay, that's one story. The second story, which I think would be consistent with the world is flat, would be, yes, but as we can see, the Americans have maxed out. The Iranians have adapted. The way they're adapting is by using the interdependent networks that exist in the world is flat model. You can always find someone to sell oil to. There's always cheaters out there who know how to work this interdependent world economy to move stuff around. The Americans themselves, for reasons that we all understand, but which are counterproductive for many of the things we do, have filled the world with $100 bills. Billions and billions and billions of $100 bills are in hands of people abroad and are available to support all kinds of commercial transactions outside of any of this, the digital systems that we discussed. So if Iran basically takes a licking and keeps on ticking, is it a point against your argument? Is it a point, ironically, in favor of the world as flat folk? Because if they're taking a licking and keep on ticking, it's because they have discovered that the world is indeed flat. There's always a way around, even in this particular case where the Americans are very active and very strong. This is kind of a crucial case for you. That's my question.
Okay, jump in, sorry. Okay, the answer to that is, it depends on exactly how it happens. There are two plausible ways in which this happens. If the Iranians are able to take advantage of existing networks, that they can sort of do an end run around whatever controls the United States, then that is evidence again, that is clear evidence against our theory. If instead we see something where the Iranians or others are able to attack the network or create a alternative network structure, that is not evidence against our theory. That is evidence that we need to pay a hell of a lot more effort and attention to the complications that Abe described at the end. But the interesting thing is that that's not the story we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing a story where Iran clearly is able to get some money for oil. There's some, so Dan wants to jump in. But we also see, a couple of days ago, China, the major Chinese company announced that it was basically stopping imports of liquid natural from Iran because the sanctions regime was getting too far. This is, I think, a good example of how this weaponized interdependence can be important. Because China's China. China's got nukes. China can just say, screw you. And in principle, but Chinese banks can't do this. They can't shelter behind the state in the same way as one would think that they ought to be able to. And this is because of their exposure to global interdependence.
I just want to say is that I think it's kind of a red herring. Like in foreign policy, does a state ever get all of its objectives? Like I think Cohen said, like there's power resources, which are kind of what power do you have as a state? Then do you actually get your objective? Well, there's all these intermediate things that come in the middle to see if you actually get your objective. And at least in the Iran case, I would say a lot of it is that it's not clear what the US objective is. And so it's very difficult to get people to follow this stuff when it's unclear what the objective is. But I think if you look at what has happened in terms of who's complying, who's not, it would follow our kind of network story. So basically all the European companies that had invested in Iran, they pulled out because they were worried about these compliance risks. The main actor, it's not a decentralized world where like Walla is saving Iran, you know, the kind of Anne Marie Slaughter or Friedman. It's China was up until recently still buying stuff, and now they're not. So, you know, it's like those kinds of things would follow this. Why is China able to do that? Because they don't have a lot of deep pockets into global financial networks. They do things for themselves.
Right, but my question was, if we look up, it, you know, Donald Trump leaves office, he loses an election,
Yes.
and a Democrat comes in. When that moment happens, or a week or a month before that moment happens, do you expect in the next 11, 12 months, the Iranians are going to stand up and say, you know, you win so badly, we want to come back to the negotiating table, renegotiate the JCPOA terms, Mr. Trump. That's the objective of Donald Trump. We put all of the power of the United States behind that objective. We muscle our allies to do it. We've been working on it for years. What I'm asking you is, will you have a question about your argument? If by the time Donald Trump leaves office, they have not succeeded.
I guess I just have a different, I think I do not think that the Trump administration has a clear objective of what does a renegotiated JCPOA even look like? I think it is very clear the Iranian regime has suffered tremendously because of these tools. Now, whether they capitulate, that's another question, and it's about what are they willing to suffer because of it. But I don't think there's any question
Well,
that these
partly
tools
it's whether
have had-
willingness to suffer, and partly whether these tools, which you're trying to elucidate,
Yes.
are as powerful as you think they are relative to other tools, which you in your argument are saying are actually rather weak, right? And I'm just positing this as a little social science test. We don't get many of them, right? And I'm asking you, what would be a test of your theory, and why wouldn't this be a test?
Yeah, I'm using advantage of my network centrality because I'm going to make 2 points and then we need to shift to the next panel. The first point is that I'm not as convinced that Iran is a good test of this, in no small part because of what Abe just said, which is the U.S. negotiating position in terms of what's being asked is so unclear that it's not obvious that in Iran's perspective, even if they were to make concessions, that there would be any kind of quid pro quo in which the U.S. would actually lift these kinds of would lift what it's done. And so part of the problem is that the Trump position on this undercuts the leverage that it's actually generating. And so I do wonder if that complicates the sort of test that you want this to be. The second point I would make, and this is sort of more back towards I think the last panel we'll have tomorrow, is that there's a difference between resistance and resilience. And you can argue to some extent what's happening in Iran right now is that Iran is undeniably resisting. Not going to concede. The demands placed by the Trump administration, to the extent that they exist, are so large that it would never occur to them to concede, because that would be sort of existential surrender as far as they're concerned. But that's different from saying that Iran is resilient. And this, where, and there's a tendency, I think, among scholars and, for that matter, policymakers, to confuse the two. Just because a country is not giving in doesn't necessarily mean they're thriving in the face of this kind of economic pressure. And so I think that's one of the other sort of ways to think about this. With that, please thank Henry and Abe, and we're going to move to the next.